I always say like this, working for LifeFlight or an air medical provider, it's this really unusual marriage. You could say collaboration, but I always say marriage of specialties, right? Like nurse clinicians, paramedics and EMTs. And then we have pilots and aviation maintenance. And we've got communications specialists. We have all these different specialties that come together in order to support the mission that LifeFlight has. We have an entire parts department that's pulling aviation parts from multiple countries, like on the daily.
Without supplies, there's no surgery. Without products, there's no patient care. Welcome to Power Supply, the healthcare supply chain podcast focused on helping you navigate the intricacies of logistics, purchasing, contracting, and supplier relationships. Each episode, we speak with healthcare executives, supply chain leaders, and innovative entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the loading dock to strategic sourcing, from buyers to the C-suite, and across the enterprise, we tackle the real-life issues impacting the healthcare supply chain. Whether you're tuning in for conversation or inspiration, we're glad you're here. You're just in time to hear it from the source and stock up on insight. So sit back and plug into Power Supply.
On this episode of Power Supply, we are going to be speaking with Victor Walco, Director of Business Development, and Casey Seckel, Chief Clinical Officer with the LifeFlight Network. And we're going to have a really interesting conversation about this unique care delivery model. And it's what's happening before they get to your hospital. And by the end of it, we're going to have some tips or maybe even a look into the future about how we can improve the expediency of delivering that care when we're making that handoff. Gary, great find. I know you know Casey especially, but also Victor, and brought him to the table. You obviously saw a real tie into supply chain here.
Yeah, for sure, Justin. This is a definite feed into where supply chain hits. You got a patient and they're affected by transfers. It's a patient transfer. It's how do we get patients where they need to get care, and supplies always follow the patient. So I'm excited to see what LifeFlight Network has to say, and kind of going down a little bit different path for our listeners, and looking forward to today's conversation.
All right, everybody stay with us. Victor and Casey up next.
I'm Hayes Walder.
This is Gary Skinner.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
A production of 17 Studios. You're listening to Power Supply.
We are speaking now with Victor Walco, Director of Business Development, and Casey Seckel, Chief Clinical Officer with LifeFlight. And I can't imagine there's anybody who's listening to this episode today who isn't familiar, at least with LifeFlight, but maybe they don't know all the ins and outs. And so there's going to be tons of stories today. I want to introduce you both and have you tell us a little bit about your background. Victor, we'll start with you.
Well, thanks so much for having us today. We really appreciate it. Yeah, my name's Victor. I'm the Director of Business Development for LifeFlight Network, and I am managing our Region 1 business, which is Oregon, Southern Washington, and our Idaho service areas. I got my start in EMS actually back when I took a wilderness first responder course, and just really kicked off my interest in caring for people, especially in the pre-hospital setting. And here I am. It's my 21st year in the air ambulance industry as a flight paramedic and manager. So it's been an exciting career.
And then Casey, how about you? Tell us a little bit about yourself and maybe how you found the LifeFlight Network.
Yeah, thanks for having us here today. So my name's Casey, Chief Clinical Officer for LifeFlight Network. Just a little bit about our organization. We span operations across 4 states, Washington, Idaho, Oregon, and Montana. We're the largest non-profit air medical transport company in the United States. I found LifeFlight. I'm a nurse by trade. I found them. Most of my background is in ER and ICU, and I kind of always wanted to fly. And LifeFlight Network was growing at the time when I entered, and it was certainly the leader that, at least externally from a safety and clinical perspective, and was the company that I wanted to work for. So I started looking for them and was hired on as a flight nurse at the LeGrand base, LeGrand, Oregon, when we opened the Pendleton, Oregon base. and then entered into management a few years later and served in various roles, and then stepped into the role as the chief clinical officer about 2 years ago this month. And this is my 10th year with LifeLight Network and about 20th year as a nurse. So here we lie today.
Well, you and I have a similar length of time being an RN. I also am a nurse, but I've never worked in any kind of EMS capacity, not even in the emergency room. And I always thought to myself, I don't know how anybody does that job on the go. And, even with just the lack of physical stability. So I just can't even imagine what it's like, trying to do the job in maybe like a less than stable physical environment. And so maybe you can kind of talk about, and when Gary lined up this interview, I was like, okay, so we're talking about helicopters, right? And he was like, well, there's actually a lot more to it. And I don't think I was even aware of that. So, can you talk about, working in that environment as a clinician and then all the different, sort of modalities, that it's not just, the fleet.
Yeah, I mean, this is great because I think probably Vic and I offer two very different perspectives. So it'd probably be good to hear certainly where Vic's perspective differs from mine as you entered into it. But when I came into flight nursing, obviously most nursing jobs happen in a hospital. So even in the emergency department, it's still a relatively controlled environment. There's generally locks on the doors and you have a fair amount of resources at your fingertips for most of the things that walk through the door. And that couldn't be more different in the flight and EMS piece. And I think that's probably the biggest surprise and biggest transition that nurses have when they transition into EMS, because it's a very different world. You're working in limited resources. We never really know what's going to happen next. And like you said, different modalities. So you mentioned helicopters. We actually operate over 30 helicopter bases, but we also have 10 fixed wing bases and a multitude of ground bases. So when our crews are on duty, they're there for their primary transport, whatever base they're assigned. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they won't be planes, trains, or automobiles. The idea is get the transport done and get the patient moved safely and efficiently to definitive care.
Well, first of all, Casey, I love that you're quoting some of one of my favorite movies of all time, Plane, Trains, and Automobiles. So there we go. So that shows my age, but I am an 80s guy, so I love the 80s. I'm just going to roll with it. But number one, too, I think about this fleet, and I want a little perspective from Casey or Victor. One of you guys to chime into this. I think about supply chain, right? And I think about the pandemic, and I'm trying to figure out how this has evolved. This in the last 2 years. Has your model changed? Did it expedite? Did it get crazy during the pandemic? Because I think that's a piece where we saw more intense, obviously with COVID and where things went. How did that change your business, or did it? How did it affect it? I want to get a little bit of background on this, and then it kind of leads into asking some more questions from Justin and I. So please give a little bit of history on that if it would be helpful.
Casey, I think it's a really great question, Gary. And I think back to when I first started in this industry and trying to provide clinical and equipment and supplies to remote bases like we have at LifeLight Network all over the Pacific Northwest. And that was before, our medical suppliers direct shipped stuff right to our bases. So just that logistical improvement from the vendors, I think has been a huge improvement to our EMS industry. We're really fortunate, and Casey could maybe speak more to it, but we're really fortunate to have the infrastructure and support that we do at LifeLight to make that a much cleaner process. And when I visit our bases, it's very rare. I can't even think of a time when the crew were like, we need or we can't get it. It's a national shortage if we don't have it. Otherwise, LifeLight, that's one of my favorite things. It's definitely well supplied and has the ability to get the supplies to our bases and to our staff.
Yeah, I mean, to Vic's point, prior to the pandemic, certainly the pandemic impacted us significantly, especially in the supply chain realm. But I guess one thing we had going for us is that based off of our geographical dispersity already, we were already set up for success in managing that piece. And, we had already implemented a digital supply room. So we kind of had a really good view of which bases had what, and we could shift pretty quickly, and we were already adapted to that. But we did face challenges with national backorder items, and then, similar to all of our EMS partners and then subsequently the hospitals, I think. But what was really cool to see in that initial phases was just this everybody coming together, whether you were competitors, whether it was our, owner hospitals or our partner hospitals. It was, hey, we need this and we have that. And let's link those people up and let's try to, to make it happen during the critical phases.
Yeah. I wonder, just as listening to this, you say bases, right? I'm just listening to your terminology. And I'm thinking there's got to be a really strong connection, a lot of people with military backgrounds. And I thought that immediately, as I was thinking about the clinicians, right? Because some of that training for EMS workers, they don't necessarily need to be a nurse, right? And just knowing like, oh, that's the kind of environment a lot of, medical providers in the military are working in. But then I was listening to you talking about the supply chain and logistics part. And I was also thinking about like the supplies may have to be in remote areas. The supplies, like how you act, like it's one thing to get the patient out of a remote area, but you got to get the supplies into the remote area and to be able to deliver that care as well. And Victor, you were talking about like direct shipping and removing that supply chain. And then it kind of occurred to me, there's a whole contingency of supply chain professionals across the country that got their supply and logistics background, through military experience and active duty or reserve. Is that kind of a true assumption? Am I on to something, just in listening to you with the terminology?
Yeah, I think, certain personalities are driven to certain fields. And so we do have a higher, I would say, just anecdotally, a higher incident of previous military experience across all of our disciplines, probably largely in our aviation world, but certainly a lot of clinicians had that experience just because that they're typically drawn to that, type of work.
Also, on the bigger picture, I think about the support that EMS and Lifelight Network certainly received during COVID from the state emergency management offices. And largely that's heavily influenced by military structure and process. And so those additional supplies, those PPE supplies that came to EMS, even small EMS agencies through their Department of Emergency Management and all the way down through the counties and the cities, it was really wonderful to see that collaboration and certainly the organization of a military-like operation.
I'm going to take this a step further because we've had some discussions about the contracted labor force, and I am just peeking at your website, looking at the team member experience, which I love. And I see nurses, paramedics, pilots, mechanics, patient transport drivers, paramedics. The contracted labor force in the healthcare arena has been an amazing endeavor where we've gone and we're trying to find it. How has that affected your world? Did you have to create some operational efficiencies? Have you been able to be fully staffed, or are you experiencing some of the same contracted labor issues as well?
Yeah, and so just to clarify, when you say contracted labor, you mean contractors or like union contracts?
Yeah, let me just come back and say, are you filling positions? I got too deep in the weeds, Skinner. Just throw it out there. How are you doing at filling positions for your company? Yep.
Actually, I knock on wood, I think we have fared that a lot better than certainly in healthcare and EMS, but even better than some of the other organizations that do the same thing we do. I think we have a benefit that we operate in a space, in an area of the country that is people want to live, right? The Northwest is a draw for a lot of folks. I think our not-for-profit status and our ability to offer benefits and pay structures that are a little bit better than some of our for-profit competitors has afforded us the ability to do that, at least from the clinician standpoint. I will say probably where we're really feeling the pain, and I think everybody is in this scenario, is in the aviation staffing and with the pilot shortage that is out there. And the commercial airlines they're offering big bucks and they need to, because they got to fill seats and fly planes. And certainly we can't compete with commercial airline offerings when it comes to salary, but that's probably where we're feeling the most pain is pilots.
Mm. You also need a different kind of supply to be able to, because you have the fleet, for people that are working even in just emergency rooms in hospitals, they might be utilizing a lot of the same supplies, but then you have this whole like supply base that you need to be able to run your fleet, right? That it does not come in to other scenarios in healthcare. Have you experienced disruption or ongoing disruption in, like, I'm assuming maybe not in fuel costs, but I'm just going there, like, parts and keeping the, like, I can only imagine what kind of unique parts you need for helicopters.
Yeah, maintenance.
Yeah, maintenance and just all of that. Is that like an additional layer that you struggled with?
It's a really interesting part of, I always say, like, this working for LifeFlight or an air medical provider, it's this really unusual marriage. You could say collaboration, but I always say marriage of specialties, right? Like nurse clinicians, paramedics and EMTs. And then we have pilots and aviation maintenance, and we've got communications specialists. We have all these different specialties that come together in order to support the mission that LifeFlight has. We have an entire parts department that's pulling aviation parts from multiple countries, like on the daily. I don't even know how they track all of that, to be honest. It's pretty incredible, but there has been some challenges in getting parts, especially when they're coming from another country, and that means
OTO.
Yeah.
Over the ocean, waiting on it as it getting produced, as it's showing up. You make me think of the clinical engineering biomed perspective in healthcare, where we're taking care of x-rays and we're taking care of MRI machines and everything else that comes inside of that. It's like your own clinical engineering biomed piece, because you got maintenance checks, you got PMs, you got everything you need to get. And I think about the costs associated with that. And Justin, I want to bring it up. You kind of brought it up, but like, I think about like cost for the LifeFlight network, and I'm like, top of the list. Am I assuming fuel? Am I assuming the wrong thing? Like, what's a supply chain? We always think about cost, and I'm like, give me your top 10 in spend in a healthcare system. Let's look at ways we can look at contracting and negotiation and see if there's ways we can get creative. And I'm like, do I ask that a LifeFlight network? Like, can you share a little bit? Like, what's your cost? What's your biggest cost ratios? So you have to deal with the stuff versus taking care of staff.
Yeah, I think any sort of clinical supply, anything that you can think of out there that is its end use is going to come in contact with the patient. It probably pales in comparison to the cost of aviation, and that could be the aircraft itself, the parts, the fuel, all that gets rolled up into basically an hourly operating cost. And when you think about what it costs just to turn the rotors, aggregate it out, that's probably the largest expense in our industry.
One of the unique things about our industry too, and I was just thinking about this the other day, was our assets are largely depreciated over time, whereas a hospital, for example, may not use that same model. So the ability to get a certain usable lifetime out of an asset like an ambulance or a helicopter or a plane. It's just a little bit of a different model and helps distribute those costs a little bit differently.
What's your reimbursement model like? Is this something that you bill hospitals for? Do you bill Medicare and Medicaid? I got to admit, I could have done, now that I'm getting into this conversation, I could have done much better prep, because I'm just thinking through it. And I'm like, I don't even know what your relationship is with the hospital that's receiving the patient when you arrive. Like, how does that all work?
Yeah, I mean, we provide this service and we bill the patient's primary insurance provider. So there's really, three types of insurance providers, government payers, so Medicare, Medicaid, TRICARE, whatnot. And then there's, commercial insurance. So Regions, whatever, that's provided by your employer. And then there's folks that aren't covered at all by insurance. And so those are really the three buckets. But yeah, the service provide is, and this is an interesting space because the people that are technically paying the bills aren't the ones that chose the service, right? Because the people that pick up the phone to call us are actually the EMS providers on scene or the hospitals that need the transfers. And so it's a really unique space. And healthcare has experienced, and especially our industry has experienced, a challenge with reimbursement in the last couple of years with regards to the No Surprises Act, which passed just over 2 years ago. And certainly the intent of the act was everybody was behind. And that is that the purpose of the act was for the patients to not receive a balanced bill. Basically a big old bill that, the insurance company didn't reimburse enough, but that the provider still, was on the hook for. But the challenges we're facing is in some of the rule writing on that, and not to go down the political front, but a lot of those were difficult for that insurer and payor relationship. And so we're seeing some challenges in that space right now.
Casey, you made it seems like a great segue. I just wanted to add, maybe it's a good opportunity to talk about Lifelight Foundation and its charitable.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Megan. I totally forgot about that. So we're owned actually by 4 hospital systems, a consortium. So OHSU, Legacy, Emmanuel, Providence, Washington and Oregon, and St. Alphonsus out of Boise, Idaho. And all of our owner hospitals have the same not-for-profit status that we have, which enables us to have a foundation. And our foundation is open for charitable giving from anybody that can and wants to contribute. And some of the ways that we use those funds is to support those patients that we pick up that may be uninsured or underinsured. And we can kind of use that basically collections of funds to, assist them in paying for those services if they can't afford them.
That's great. I want to take this a step further. I'm thinking about our listeners as boots on the ground. I think the foundation is great. I also want to take it to some of the expertise in supply chain. We have a diverse amount of listeners on Power Supply. Can you guys share what are some best practices? I'm all about the patient and mission. I was taught that a long time ago. You get into fiduciary responsibility after you take care of patients and you have the mission in front of everything. But what are some best practices you can share that you see things that are going really well, like you're trying to get a patient, maybe Casey, this is more in your direction, or Victor, you've got some experience too, but what are some best practices you can share that you see with other organizations that have worked really well on efficiencies, or is it follow-up? Is it S-bars? What do you do with kind of those best patient practices to get, you're saving lives. You really are. You're a part of that. So I would like you to share a little bit with our end users to hear.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think if you were to ask me, what is it that we do the best, or how do we impact the patient outcome the most, and what can we offer? It's time. That's what it is, right? So what we really provide, and we have highly experienced clinicians and great aircraft and experienced pilots, and we could do a lot of things in the back of the aircraft, and we really provide a higher level of care to some of these small rural areas that don't have the resources that they need. But really what we're providing is time. So anything that what we are constantly looking at, Gary, and I appreciate the question, we're constantly looking at is what can we do to safely and efficiently decrease the amount of time from the patient to get from, either a scene or, let's say, a rural healthcare facility to definitive care. And that's kind of what we're always looking at. And so we have a pretty robust quality management system. And so we're looking at aggregated data of, what are scene times and what are our liftoff times, and what are the operational challenges that we have created as an organization that are barriers for our team members to reduce those times? Again, all around, how do we do that in a safe and efficient manner so that we're not putting our crews at any more risk or the patient at any more risk? And so to pick a list, it would be really hard because it kind of depends on the month and what the data is saying. But I think it's always around, how do we reduce that out of hospital time for the patient?
Casey makes such a great point that I think Lifelight Network, I believe firmly that Lifelight Network has a very focused effort going into what is in the patient's best interest that we're transporting, and keeping that would be the message that I would share with anybody, I think. And it's been a great lesson I learned over these years, is that if the decisions we're making are really truly made based on what's in the patient's best interest, things are going well, and we're doing a good job for our patients and for our EMS and hospital customers as well. Our crews are getting there quickly and helping expedite that transport of that patient, to Casey's point.
What's it like when you're making the handoff once you arrive at the facility? Because like you said, time is what you're really buying them, right? So I can imagine you've got a lot of, and probably with today's technology, you're able to communicate so much information before you even arrive. Whereas in the past, there was probably a total information dump. 20 years ago, I can imagine you're just rattling stuff off as you're it's a little bit like that ER TV show, right? You're getting all the information download as they're coming in. How much are you able to share in advance of arriving with that whole handoff? How quickly does that happen? I'm imagining most people are headed right to surgery when you're bringing them in a lot of cases. Like, can you describe that? Maybe this is for Casey, but can you describe that kind of that environment, like in that moment and the flow? Because there's, I realize it's not supply logistics, but there's definitely a clinical care delivery logistics piece that's
there's
going on.
There's supply chain all around this too. I'm thinking about everything that's going with it. I'm thinking about everything that's floating with them, though. You're right on, Justin. There's OpEx and there's supply chain all over this. So please.
It's interesting. I not to go off topic, but this week is National EMS Week. And so we've been kind of conveying our gratitude and our thanks to our employees. And I think a lot of times that gets focused around the people that are actually touching the patients, right? But to your point with the supply chain, it takes so much to make one transport happen. And that's down to, the person in accounts payable that's paying the bills and, the person in the comm center that's picking up the phone. It takes all of these people working together to transport that. And a lot of times what the public sees is the nurse and the paramedic that are, taking the patient off the aircraft and rolling them into the hospital. But just like a hospital and just like EMS agencies, there's so much behind the scenes that it's happening in that supply chain, if you will, to make that one transport happen. But to answer your larger question on the handoff, it's probably it's not that much different than what you're thinking. We have two types of calls. There's a scene call, meaning we're going directly to like the scene of an accident or to pick up a patient, and then we go directly to the hospital. And then we have the interfacility calls, meaning we're transporting somebody from, probably a smaller rural hospital into a tertiary care facility. And so in those facilities, the information is a little bit more because that receiving facility is going to get a call from the sending facility. They'll get an update from our team en route, and then our team will provide, the most recent information once they arrive. And that scene information has probably not changed much over the years. Yes, technology advanced, but we don't have the ability to use cell technology in transport because we're flying. So we do have sat phone capabilities, but we're not transmitting a ton of things prior to. It's generally just a heads up on the radio of what we're bringing in. And every receiving facility is a little different about what they want. Again, we're operating in 4 states, and you'd be surprised how different each of these places, even that are owned by the same organizations, kind of just have their own internal protocols. So we learn what they want and what they like, and we try to convey the information that they're asking for.
Victor, this might be a good one for you, just in following up on that. We did an episode, I think it was last season, about, things like hospital at home and universal medical record, where the information is actually owned by the patient. How much help would it be for there to be a true universal medical record that just flows seamlessly, as you're kind of this middleman, from point of incident or stabilization to, receiving, higher level, acuity care?
Gosh, I know it's a huge discussion on the national level, especially from that EMS first response perspective, right? On the LifeFlight side, rarely are we the first providers to the patient, but I do believe honestly, and as a paramedic, who worked on an ambulance in Los Angeles, like showing up with very little information or maybe even a language barrier when you arrive to the patient and trying to have just some place to start, it would be hugely beneficial. And I know several of our hospital and healthcare partners are working on that exact interface so that hospital patient care record data can be made available to their EMS partners. We're seeing that in several regions. Casey'd have to touch on how that would fit into LifeFlight's operations, but I do see a benefit. And I think, from an EMS perspective, and how we receive patients from our EMS customers and partners, it'd be incredible. It'd be like a next level patient report. Although we try to spend as little time as possible on our scene calls and start that patient movement towards the definitive care they need, I think often we hear, what is the patient's history? And we just didn't have that information available to us at the time of report. Casey, how do you feel that might integrate with our operations in the future?
That'd be a game changer, right? I think that, like, as Vic alluded to, we are often the middleman, right? And so, you play that game of telephone, like I heard this thing and, maybe I wrote that down, and then they're with us for a little while, and then we transmit that information and it goes down and down and down the line. Even with as the patient navigates different departments in the hospital, we, like I said, work with a fair amount of different facilities, and some of them are on certain electronic patient care record systems and versus others, and ours talks to some of them, and some of them they don't, and so that is always a challenge. And I truly think that the introduction or the ownership of that information at the patient level would greatly increase outcomes, right? Because the more knowledge that you have about that patient's history, the better you're going to tailor their treatment to their needs. And that gets really difficult when the patient's not able to communicate, right? Whether they're unconscious or they perhaps have altered mental status. That's when it gets even trickier, that handoff stuff, if you don't have the records of, where the patient's coming from and what's happened previously.
We are already experiencing some improvement with bidirectional communication with our records at LifeLight and the receiving hospitals, more on the receiving side, Justin, than on the patient collection side. I think it's interesting, and we hear oftentimes that it's difficult for health systems to get EMS records. And so they, an hour or multiple hours into the care, they want to know, what did EMS provide that patient, and have a more detailed understanding. And I think we're really fortunate to have the start of that integration where the hospitals can just see, oh, this is what LifeLight did. These are the medications that were provided. These are the interventions that were made. And it definitely directly impacts the care, the continuance of care.
Yeah, I'm even thinking like on all of these emergency and trauma scenarios, picking the right instrument sets for if they are going to need a surgical procedure, all of that. You talked about time being so important, and that's really why I bring that up, is really from this materials management side. Is there a way to know what needs to be done ahead of time enough? And if we had that conduit of communication ahead of time, just think, you could have the room, the OR room ready to go with everything that you would need, or pretty close, that you could anticipate essentially as soon as the patient comes. And obviously you'd still be doing an assessment and making sure, and x-rays and everything else has to be done. But I'm just thinking, like, if there was a way to almost help supply chain have those supplies ready, or what if they didn't have a certain type of a set, or another trauma case had just come in and the set's being reprocessed, like, to get that going ahead of time from a logistics perspective. I still think to me, there's still a lot of opportunity for us with what technology affords us to really take advantage of. Every second counts, like you really mentioned, Casey. Before we wrap up, do you guys want to build off of that at all? Like the potential, for improvement on that supply chain area? Like, because I just feel like right now the data interchange is going through too many hands for that to be as expedient as it could be. And you guys understand the value of time better than anybody else. Yeah.
And I think this is probably more Vic's world, is like, we spent a lot of time building relationships with our receiving facility partners in order to decrease the friction at the patient handoff piece, but also decrease the amount of time it takes, and so that they can be prepared as much as possible to care for that patient. But like I mentioned, one of the challenges we face is we work in so many different areas. It's hard to really standardize that, because every hospital is a little different in how they prepare and how they manage and how they navigate those challenges. But I mean, I guess, looking towards the future, Justin, like I think that's the next step for us from a technological standpoint, is what technologies exist or can exist to implement so that we can convey real-time assessment data from the field to the destination, and how can we leverage that technology to add to the timepiece, to decrease that piece, whether that's, like you mentioned, the OR tech preparing the right supplies, or the lab, preparing the right amount of blood. Anything in that world is where I would look to from the technology piece to help us improve that.
Totally makes sense. I'll sign up for the chip to be implanted into my body with my record.
It's so funny you say that. I actually thought about that, because when we were talking about the EMR, and Victor was kind of talking about somebody who doesn't speak English, and I was thinking, well, what if we don't have their driver's license? What if they don't have,
a lot of times you don't. An MVA, you show up at an MVA, you got nothing. Everything's scattered. I mean, you can't find anything.
Yeah. So then I thought, oh, the chip. And then I thought, that's not going to be a popular.
I'm signing up. I'm in. I'll do it.
That was Gary, not me.
All right, Victor. I can see you chomping at the bit. You're going to close us out. I can see you got something to add.
There's a whole Reddit thread that's going to be off of that, Gary.
I remember this conversation. Skinner was part of it. Yeah. Yeah, this is good.
There are several major third-party companies working on a data transfer. There's a handful in the United States, right, that are making good headway in this exact direction, how to get the hospital the information they need, and also bidirectionally, how to get the EMS providers the information that we need, to provide excellent care before we arrive at the hospital and have a better understanding of that patient. I think it's headed in the right direction, and we're seeing some positive outcomes in certain regions. It'll be really, I think, an exciting next 5 years.
And I think it's important to highlight what Vic said on that bidirectional communication, because yes, it's very much important about getting the patient there and making sure that they have that. But we also need to know, did we do it right? And if we didn't do it right, what did we not do right? And how can we change our practices or our guidelines to do it better the next time? And so that feedback loop from the hospital of, this is how the patient did, and this is, some things that, could have been done better or had prepared that patient better, or could have been done en route to prepare that patient better. If we don't know that because we drop the patient off and walk out the door and we don't see you again, we're not going to improve our pieces. So that bidirectional communication is wildly important to us. And we take any feedback that we get from patient outcomes or from the facilities that are willing to share it with us, and it goes right back into our quality management program to see where we can apply any of those, whether it's a policy change or education to our crews or, changing our own supply chain to make that next patient experience faster and better as well.
Yeah, I don't think SurveyMonkey is going to get you the information that you're looking for, in that area. It's definitely going to need that bidirectional communication. I'll just say this, for everybody in the audience, primarily, working in supply chain, as we look at different technologies, terms like standardization, lots of things that you talked about here, so important to them. But even evaluating technologies to bring into the equation, but then also just the importance of, I think, interoperability and getting that flow, like really from one system to another. It's a daunting effort. And I do think supply chain understands how important it is, because information exchange has been a major focus of supply chain for quite some time. And they know they can do a better job. And many other industries are already doing better with this. Healthcare tends to lag behind in this arena. Gentlemen, really, really great conversation today. Thanks for the important work that you do as well. Casey, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thank you guys both for having us.
Thank you so much.
All right, Gary, we were speaking with Victor Walco, Director of Business Development, and Casey Seckel, Chief Clinical Officer with LifeFlight Network. And honestly, when you lined this up at first, I was like, how are we exactly going to tie this into supply chain? I'm super interested, especially as a nurse who hasn't worked in emergency services anywhere in my career, in all of how LifeFlight works. I just think it's neat, and it's something I don't know a lot about. So I was excited. But there are a lot of supply and logistics considerations here. And even as we are getting to the end, is like the flow of information. All of us are working together on care delivery. And one of the biggest things that we've tried to do, not only on this show, but on all of the sister podcasts as well, is to break down those silos and help find ways for different departments to work together that are within the hospital. What's really cool about this is we're talking about what are some ways in that, especially that information exchange, where when a hospital is receiving a patient that's in a critical situation, how do we, really try to all work together as even external partners? I don't think we've had a conversation like that before.
No, it's different. It just once again says why power supply and supply chain hits all avenues. It does. You talk about that patient being transferred to, I think a lot of people go LifeFlight Network, helicopter. They see a helicopter. Oh, that's a patient. They think that, but it's a fleet. It's ground, it's flight, it's fixed wing. There's all these bits and pieces that come with it. And with that comes a patient. And that patient isn't just on a podcast hanging out with us. That patient has things hooked up to them. There's a trauma situation. There's all kinds of things going on, and supplies follow that patient. So taking the best care of the patient, supply chain is an integral part of this delivery, working with the clinical teams, with IT that we talked about, with getting that information over. But just another area where supply chain hits, and I think it was a great discussion, and it's going to catch some listeners by surprise too on, we're talking about the Life network and, fixed wing and helicopters and ground fleet. What's it look like? So I liked it.
Yeah, it's mobile healthcare delivery. That's for sure. All right. Well, that's going to do it for this show. But I do want to remind everybody that these podcasts are now approved in our partnership with AHRMM. You can get 0.5 CECs towards your CMRP certification, and we'll continue to explore other opportunities in that arena as well, bringing you additional value by listening to these episodes. Just go and check out the write-up for the episode. You'll see a link in there. You can complete a quiz and you'll get your certificate. Don't forget to download our smartphone app. Search for Power Supply Podcast in the App Store or Google Play, depending on if you use Android or Apple. You can send us an email, info@powersupplymedia.net. But more than anything, if you enjoyed this episode or any others, we'd love it if you commented on the post on social media. Connect with us, follow Power Supply Media, reach out to Gary Hayes or myself, and connect with us on LinkedIn. We'd love to hear from you. And on behalf of Gary and myself, thanks for listening to this episode of Power Supply.